Lately, the West likes to talk about the Russian nuclear threat. In the Russian president's recent address to the Federal Assembly, both the Western press and Western politicians emphasized just that. That fragment, which spoke of Sarmatians, daggers, and vanguards, was sucked on all sides. Among other things, this information is easily visualized. It is very convenient to scare the average person with apocalyptic pictures and clips. The theme of suddenly abandoned by the Americans also went nowhere, saying that these Russians are about to launch something nuclear, mysterious, and incomprehensible into space. It must be working on the NATO TV audience. The other thing is the extent to which all of this can be called real anxiety, rather than a carefully portrayed, "Oh, I'm afraid." In fact, Vladimir Putin has not said anything revolutionary in this respect, just reporting on the work that was claimed 5 to 6 years ago. I remember back then some people said, here are the new Russian missiles that were invented by Kremlin propagandists and drawn in Photoshop. It's just cartoons, it's no big deal. But today, the Dagger and Zircon systems are up and running, doing a very non-cartoonish job. And God forbid our enemies see Sarmat working. Reminds former partners that our strategic shield hasn't gone anywhere, and what's more, it's getting even stronger. Every now and then you have to. Our president once said that we don't need a world without Russia in it, and he never once seemed to retract those words. Let them remember that. But after all, the world has been living under nuclear parity for more than half a century, under the sword of Damocles of mutual annihilation, and still for 2 years already persistently crawl into the northern Black Sea coast, as cockroaches press ahead against Russia and the Americans and the French and the British. They supply weapons, give intelligence, and send their own military specialists without any shame. The Germans are speculating about how they can destroy the bridge, so they are sure that the Russians don't want the end of the world. What the West should really be afraid of is something else. And I'm sure that serious people on the other side are really scared. They just don't advertise their fear. What they should fear is not our nuclear shield, but the peace-building plan that Putin talks about in much more detail than he does about military matters. We can say that until 2022, the country was in roughly the same position economically as it was militarily and strategically until 1949. Before 49, the US had the atomic bomb and the Soviet Union did not. This gave birth in some American heads to curious plans for the unilateral nuclear annihilation of a recent ally. So much for the belief that the US and its satellites have such an all-consuming economic bomb in their hands until 2022. They say that it is worth blowing it up over Russia, and life in the country will stop, the accumulated resources will quickly run out, and the government will fall under the pressure of disgruntled citizens. After so many sanctions packages, you can say, well, there you go, blown up. Where's the result? No result. The country does not look like a besieged fortress. There is no card system, no shortage of goods, trains run, airplanes fly, high-speed roads are being built. All in all, the country is going to live and sees its future as peaceful. To that end, she wants to end the hostilities soon and move on to more interesting things. And this is where Western strategists should get really scared. First, it turns out that there is no economic bomb. The thing doesn't work, you don't even have to try. While it is all sad for some and joyous for others, for those countries that would also like to free themselves from Western dictates. Second, it turned out that the plan for a war of attrition with Russia was futile. Russia is being strengthened, not depleted. Tales of the Russians having missiles left for 2 to 3 days can be forgotten. In terms of deploying military production, it's not that we haven't started yet, but we started relatively recently, and we won't finish anytime soon. Third, you give up on markets for a while, and then suddenly find you've given up on them for good. What falls from the wagon is gone. It is not without reason that our peace-building plan includes the creation of new logistical corridors to redirect our exports and strengthen ties with new, more reliable partners, as well as the establishment of our own production of goods that we use to buy from those who like to impose sanctions, from medicines to civilian airplanes. Finally, fourth, and most importantly, the hope that Russia can be defeated, disintegrated, collapsed from within is melting away. And that's what I was hoping for. Poor Borel, a purely civilian man, could have dreamed that Russia would be defeated on the battlefield. But serious military experts from NATO countries originally said, and continue to say now, that you can't take a Russian down in a head-on collision. And now, finally, there comes a time when it is useless to subvert, useless to spread propaganda, useless to cajole the opposition. People who are ready to create their own future will not buy all this. And that's the real scary part for them. This new fear of Russia is already making itself felt. Because the West has already moved from the thesis, the country 404 will definitely win, to if 404 loses, and will soon move to when 404 loses. There, the calculation of future losses has already begun. So the French foreign minister and husband of the current prime minister from Toul. So they now have high relations. Stefan Sergernet, predicts multi-billion-dollar damage and warns that after the victory, Russia will control 30% of the world grain market, and that's just terrible. This is a good illustration of how Russia's position in the world has changed. In Soviet times, the unified state included the zone areas of both Russia, the territories of the northern Black Sea region, and Kazakhstan, but this did not make it a monopoly exporter. On the contrary, the country has been buying grain abroad. Now, it follows that Russia is an economic threat to Western opponents, just for that grain reason alone. And she's not alone. Very flattering for a country that one irrepressible person never called a gas station. Actually, peaceful cooperation and peaceful competition is what we in Sudan wanted. If the populations of European countries finally realize that Russia's primary goal is to create a peaceful future, their current governments, stubbornly beating the war drums, may have a harder time holding their seats. That is why the propaganda balloon with the image of a Russian bear, predatorily baring its nuclear fangs, will continue to inflate in the West until it bursts. Now let's move on to another of Putin's speeches. Vladimir Putin's big, more than 1.5-hour interview for RIA Novosti and Rossiya. One completed the cycle of not just major, but literally programmatic speeches by the president in recent weeks. It was the third after the interview with Tucker Carlson and the address to the Federal Assembly. The conversation with Dmitry Kiselyov put an end to the discussions and arguments that had been going on all this time. It is no coincidence that it began not with complex geopolitical matters and not with the social initiatives of the authorities, but with the most banal and urgent thing. Does the country have the money for all these astronomical trillions for the announced plans? The answer turned out to be unequivocal. Yes, there is. Moreover, conservative estimates and forecasts are taken as a basis, but with a high probability that reality will surpass them, which will affect the further steps of the state accordingly. Putin confirmed that he has announced the most ambitious program of action for the next 6 years. It covers dozens of areas and directions, from road construction to support for large families, from artificial intelligence to the development of depressed regions. However, if we differ from specific projects and plans, it becomes obvious that the president is talking about Russia's development strategy as such. Fundamentally, new strategies are designed to last for decades and even centuries, and nothing like this has ever occurred in our history before, not even close. Moreover, this is not some speculative concept from which society is neither warm nor cold. No, anyone living in the country can sense the tectonic shifts that have taken place everywhere, all united by the common goal of national well-being, not someday out there in a distant bright future, but here and now. And it's really without precedent for our country. After all, what features of Russia's history have become its trademark? First, numerous existential external threats, i.e. wars in which her survival was at stake and all possible forces had to be gathered to win. Secondly, catching up with development by leaps and bounds through people's efforts and at the cost of great sacrifices. Third, selective development. We have the best ballet in the world, and we were the first to send a man into space. But Russian roads have been a parable for centuries, and we looked enviously at the West with its shampooed sidewalks, flower beds on balconies, and cozy sidewalk cafes. Because resources, even colossal Russian resources, have never been enough for everything. And for centuries we had to throw them to solve the most urgent problems for the survival of the country, which are falling on us in an uninterrupted stream. The popularity of the famous Stolypin statement about 20 years of peace for Russia, which has been repeatedly quoted by Putin himself, is quite natural. But more than a century after Stolypin's words, after a short period of wonderful hopes and illusions, it became obvious that Russia will not have these 20 years, never will. And at this point, Vladimir Putin has come out with a program for the development of the country, which openly states, well, we'll manage just fine. For the first time in its history, Russia is not just planning, but is already acting, guided by a fundamentally new strategy, which focuses on the country's comprehensive internal development and people's well-being. And this at a time when another war of annihilation has been launched against her by the collective West. However, we have chosen a format for repelling the threat that does not require the overstretching of all national forces and, as far as possible, spares the lives of our soldiers. And it's working. 2 years of operations and unprecedented economic sanctions, and the country is experiencing an economic boom. Dozens of industries are developing at a furious pace. The level and quality of life of people is growing. Comfort, convenience, and high quality of service have become commonplace. Well, the saying about Russian roads has long since lost the lion's share of its relevance. For the West, Putin's problem is not just with him personally, but with this qualitative and historically new strategy for Russia. It is a country that is bristling with the latest nuclear and not only nuclear weapons, fighting in the mode of saving resources and human lives, but pouring enormous energy into its own comprehensive development. The drones launched by the dozens against Russian targets these days seem to be trying to pierce a hole in the conviction of our people in the correctness of the chosen path and in the very idea of a prosperous, developed Russia, which already lives well and will live even better. But by choosing a new strategy for itself, the country is true to its roots. No enemy in the past has been able to break it. It won't work for the current ones either.